What's going on, everyone? So set 2 has been out for, well, a decent amount of time now, and I want to talk about a few cards that I absolutely got wrong. Whether or not they are way worse than I thought they were going to be, way better, deck defining, etc., etc. There are just a few cards here that have really stood out and are probably cards that you're familiar with and immediately think of when you think of certain decks. That's because they are as defining as they are. Before we do, guys, real quick thank you to my Patreons here. You might see them scrolling by, and I have a TCG player link in the description down below to pick up any of the cards I will talk about today. Let's talk about some cards that I got really wrong. First one up is Snoke. Now, the reasoning behind this one was I initially thought Snoke was going to be kind of a mediocre addition to the more hard control decks that we were really seeing in set 1. Set 1 was kind of dominated by some of the more really hard control, like double blue Iden, Vader blue. You also had the Boba greens, the Sabine greens, and Boba yellows still, but hard control was actually one of kind of the pillars within the meta. Snoke didn't really seem like an amazing option in those decks, but it turns out that what he really works well with is the soft control decks. Things like, well, Hondo Blue, for example, or things like Krennic Green, or all these sort of mid-rangey to late game decks that are trying to curve out, makes all of your other units better by playing something that reduces all of their power. And more importantly, it actually just locks out the game against certain decks. Like if you're against Sabine Green or even Boba Yellow in some cases, they just have such small units in the earlier game or even into the middle of the parts of the game, like Cantina Bouncer, for example, or you think of like some of the ambushers like Wrecker. They can't really do what they're trying to do if they're shrunken down. Like Wrecker is a significantly less scary threat when he comes in as only 5 power versus 7. And you think about like Poe Dameron, he's like a 4/4 now. Cantina Bouncer is a 1/3. It kind of locks out the game and just puts a massive stranglehold if you are in the mid-range mirror. Or even in the soft control mirror, because you're going to be kind of sizing up all of your units way better than your opponent because all of theirs are shrunk by -2, -2. The other thing that it gets rid of, and this is pretty important in these more controlling decks, is, well, another card that has been really, really impressive, and that is Tai Phantom. It just kills it when it comes into play, so they can't even set up for potentially kind of surprising you with an undefeatable unit, besides like unit combat and things like that, as a Tai Phantom. This card's been pretty impressive, and I usually have 1 to 2 copies at least in my more mid-rangey blue villainy based decks, and that's a pretty consistent spot for it. Even if you're playing red and you have a kind of an option like Palpatine, you're probably dropping in a couple Snokes as well, because oftentimes Palpatine doesn't even work as well as Snoke, even though Palpatine could potentially hit some things that are bigger than just 2 toughness. The fact that it shrinks down the power with Snoke kind of makes them irrelevant, and oftentimes, dealing a couple points of damage is good enough to kill a lot of things with Snoke, or with Palpatine, and so Snoke kind of does that same job. Snoke's pretty good, and definitely has gotten way higher on my list, because I thought this guy was going to be kind of close to not really played at all. Next one on our list is the Chaos of War. Now, this is a card that I thought was going to be a massive game changer for double red decks. I was thinking Sabine red, I was thinking New Han red, I was thinking basically any aggressive deck that could be double red. Realistically, this seemed like an immediate home for it. But what I found is this card's been pretty unimpressive. Now, the reason being is usually in the game, you're looking to kind of deploy threats up until around the 5-6 resource spot, and that's when you sort of deploy a lot of your tricks. The surprise factor of these burn cards really close out the game, while earlier on in the game you're kind of rushing down your opponent with either some nice statted units or just that in combination with your leader. Again, Sabine red, New Han red, these are the decks that I was really considering it in. The problem is that most of the time you are getting like 2 to 3 damage off of this. And that's not terrible, right? That's not like unplayable. But if you compare it to like 4 Cause, for example, Sabine for 3 resources was getting, 4 damage on average. And even new Han can do the same thing because they're playing a lot of heroism units, especially with the addition of Wreckers and Poes and all these things, even outside of like double red Sabine, like double green red Sabine or Sabine yellow, these types of things. Chaos of War just doesn't really fit in a lot of these strategies, as you have too many events and too many like upgrades and situational things that it kind of makes your deck a little bit less consistent, while also not even being that much of a payoff. Now, in some matchups, it could be excellent. The matchups that are really good in, against like Palpatine matchups where they're drawing a lot of cards, Chaos of War can hit for like 5 or 6. Against the decks that are playing Queels, heck, even like Ray Blues, where they have like Yodas and Obi-Wans, they're drawing a bunch of cards. This can hit for like, again, 5 to 6. And that's where Chaos of War truly shines. But again, the way I thought about this card when it first came out was we saw Daring Raid, we saw Chaos of War, we were seeing things like, already For a Cause and these other burn type cards, things that can deal damage directly to our opponent's base, that this seemed like an immediate inclusion. And I immediately tried it, and I was immediately disappointed in kind of its reliability. Again, this more of is a sideboard option rather than a 3 of main deck like For a Cause that I thought it was going to be. Oh boy, this next one, this one has literally, as I said in the beginning of the video, spawned entire archetypes essentially around this card. The Ray Red discard package is kind of hallmarked by Pillage. You have things like Han Blue that are just playing the decks, playing Pillage. You have now Vader Greens and other decks that are running Pillage in some amounts in their main deck. This is a card that I thought was going to be kind of whatever and maybe playable as a sideboard option against the more hard control decks. It turns out this is one of the best cards in a ton of different matchups. You're finding things against even like Boba Yellow, Han Yellow, the heavy ramp decks, Palpatine Green, and of course the controlling decks as well. It's just a kind of a staple. The only decks that it really doesn't function against are the hyper aggressive decks, generally speaking, but there are even spots in those games where hitting a Pillage on the right situation can win you the game. If you're fighting a Sabine Green and they're relying on this end game curve to finish out the game, like a Poe and a Wrecker, hitting a Pillage at a proper time can really disrupt that and ruin their game plan. The idea behind this is, initially, 4 resources, discard 2. That's really kind of weak when your opponent gets to kind of sculpt their hand with 2 additional cards every single turn. But if you look at kind of the archetypes, the ramp decks usually are looking to use a lot of their cards in hand to actually get additional resources into play, then also getting more resources into play by using those resources that they already put into play. So you usually have a mix of ramping while also, playing units to not die. And that mix gets reduced heavily when you get discarded because you lose options and you suddenly have to make a choice. In the more tempo-oriented matchups, it's kind of similar in that they want to be disrupting you, but they also want to be aggressive. And if they're deploying some aggressive units and then you pillage them at the right time, they could be completely bereft of their events, things like cunning and stuff that they were relying on to kind of close out the game. And the reverse is true as well. So if they kind of didn't have a unit to start off and they maybe started off with an event like Spark Rebellion, for example, you like double Pillage in hand, boom, you pillage them, you get rid of the 2 cards. Han Yellow is especially affected by this because he directly converts cards in hand into resources that they can use immediately. And so reducing just the amount of cards that he has in hand reduces the amount of options that he has. And you've seen Ray Red really pop off with Pillage. You've seen Han Blue really pop off with Pillage, each taking some spots in tournaments. And there are even other decks as well that are including Pillage within their lineup. So really, really powerful option. And then, I was definitely wrong about this one. In fact, a lot of us, when we were first looking at this card, were like, how could this be good? Especially for those of us coming from Magic. Now, this one might be surprising because we have the Tai Phantom on the list, not because I thought it was going to be bad by any means, but because I already thought it was going to be good in the spoiler season. I was like, okay, a 2/2 in space seems pretty solid. Raid 2, attacks for 4 seems like a very nice, aggressively statted unit. And, as far as I had initially interpreted this, I was like, okay, well, things like Power of the Dark Side, Takedown don't really work on this. And all that's true, but I didn't realize how devastating Tai Phantom would really be. Maybe because I just didn't put the pieces together, and a lot of us didn't put the pieces together. And on top of that, even nowadays, this card still confuses people because they don't understand, oh, make an opening can kill it, but nothing else really can for the most part. This card has spawned literally dark and yellow space alongside triple dark ray. Those are the two hallmark cards of that deck, and is basically completely reliant on this as a way to win in a lot of situations. You have it found in, well, sideboards, but also main decks of the Boba Yellow deck, because it just works super well against anyone running Power of the Dark Sides. You can really get in a ton of additional damage if you happen to have controlled the space arena already, with maybe like a Cartel Spacer, or, you know, with a 7th Fleet Defender, by, you know, controlling the space and then just getting in for 4. Because it's a 4 powered attacker on, well, the 3 resource mark, it actually is equivalent to a lot of the ground units, which makes it actually not a downside that you're racing in a more kind of difficult to interact with arena. And all of that to say, it really, really does improve your chances in certain archetypes as well. If you are fighting against control, or any sort of deck that is like a soft control, hard control, or even more of a mid-range deck, they just have a really hard time dealing with Tai Phantom. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're seeing make an opening full 3-ofs in main decks. It's why you're seeing entrenched in some cases. It's why you're seeing these types of cards. And it's why you're seeing you, in some cases, have to have certain space units to actually deal with this in combat. And even if you can, oftentimes will just trade, which is really, really quite good for your opponent, no matter what. So this card has turned from like, oh, this is just like a good on-curve unit. I can see this being played as like a pretty staple unit in Cunning Villainy, which is, by the way, a very stacked archetype, into this is literally the card you build entire decks around. Like hard control and soft control, you can't even go and build your deck without thinking about this card, because this completely ruins your whole deck, and oftentimes completely wins your entire win condition, which is Avenger most of the time. Again, so this card went from, in my initial, you know, kind of evaluation, to pretty good, seems like a maybe a staple, into, oh my gosh, this is game changing, format warping type card. Dr. Evon probably had the longest hype period, because if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the first spoilers that we had, if not the very first one. I remember doing some videos on it and being pretty excited about Dr. Evon at the time, as I was like, dang, this card looks really, really sweet. A 3/3 shielded, mind you, what we were previously working with was a 2/2 Crafty Smuggler, which was a 2/2 shielded onto. So this felt like, dang, 3/3 stat line, way better for many reasons. Remember, Crafty Smuggler oftentimes does not trade or does not actually kill a unit if they immediately attack into it. So this 3/3 stat line seemed pretty oppressive, right? They play a Battlefield Marine, you play a Dr. Evon, and suddenly your Dr. Evon just kills Battlefield Marine for free, which Battlefield Marine was previously like the best turn 1 play you could be doing in Rebel decks, which was just, again, seemingly absurd. Alongside that, it had the Underworld tag, which seemed pretty important. Now, one of the things I said initially was, this seems like a pretty good staple in Boba Yellow, or in a lot of the Cunning Villainy archetypes, because it's just such a powerful stat line. I also mentioned that while the bounty is extremely, extremely rough in some cases, there are ways that you can control it by trading into your opponent's units. Here's what the reality is. You don't want to be doing any of that, and you just want to be disrupting your opponent with Boba Yellow and getting in for damage into their base, and you don't want to be in a situation where your opponent ever has, 8 resources on turn 3 because they've killed your Dr. Evon. That's not to say this card is terrible, unplayable, but in the decks that we initially kind of thought, well, this card is kind of unplayable. Like, I would never play this in Boba Yellow. I've tried. When I first built Boba Yellow, Dr. Evon was a full 3 of, and then I slowly went down to like 2 of, and then 1 of, and then I just realized that I never want this card in certain matchups, because it just is such a liability for your progress in the game. And that is pretty consistent across the board. The one exception, or I guess the couple of exceptions, is when you play like a Dr. Evon against like a Kylo Red player, and you don't really care about them readying up resources because they're going to be empty-handed anyways. So this is definitely one of the most disappointing cards that I thought, and again, it was one of the most hyped because it was one of the first ones, and we would always refer to it when we would talk about these other ones. Like, again, when we were considering Forlom and Zuckuss when they were coming out, we were like, dang, these cards are going to be really, really good, and they turned out to be really, really good. But they also were talked alongside with things like Dr. Evazan because they were in the same color combination, same aspect combination, and they seem to be curving into each other. But unfortunately, Dr. Evazan's bounty is just too ridiculously harsh for things like tempo decks. Of course, it makes sense as they're looking to leverage the resource advantage. There are ways you could play around Dr. Evazan, but it's generally just a huge liability in your deck. Oh man, this last one makes me a little bit sad because Evacuate was a card that I was extremely excited about. Now, this is a card that, well, I've gotten in draft like 3 times. It is my most drafted legendary of the whole set, and it's not even like a bomb in the draft format. For those of you that don't know what draft is, I mean, you're building a deck out of packs that you've just opened and you're passing it around the table. Like, it's not a very high power level format, and Evacuate isn't even like insanely impressive in there. It does come into play and can win you games. It's definitely a strong card, but when you consider constructed in Premier, I mean, Evacuate has just kind of fallen flat on its face. There's just too many ways to get immediate value out of your cards already within the first 2 sets. If you look at all these different things like Wrecker being ECL and Podameron coming down, like these things just attack you for 1,000,000 points of damage, and you can't even really leverage the fact that you're bouncing a ton of things because every single thing is honestly a must kill in the aggro archetypes. In the tempo archetypes, your events are going to get stripped from your hands. So sitting on like an Evacuate or a Super Laser Blast can be really tricky because they have like Bodhis. You have Kiras that can extend the cost. You have things like Spark Rebellions that can rip them from your hand. All these things that are really rough. And at the end of the day, playing a control deck or even a mid-range deck with the Cunning tag is already tough. The deck that I initially thought this would potentially go into was a Thrawn deck where you're playing things like Frozen and Carbonite, you're playing things like Entrenched, you're playing things like Evacuate, and you're using the Thrawn action, because one of the ways you kind of return to stability with Thrawn is a Super Laser Blast, and I was feeling, okay, Evacuate could kind of be like an earlier version of that, but Thrawn just really has not impressed at all. It is really rough to be playing those more hard control decks. And Evacuate just doesn't bring it up to parity compared to a lot of the other archetypes that we have right now. In Evacuate itself, the just fact that you're really looking for this to kind of be almost like a board wipe, but it ends up just kind of stalling your opponent for a little bit is really unfortunate. In other games, the fact that you're really bouncing everything to your opponent's hand can be really rough. The other thing that's really tricky about this one is that it says each non-leader unit, so you're even still getting hit by their leader, which usually comes down on 6 resources. So that could be really unfortunate as well. This is a card that I thought was going to kind of revive or potentially put some archetypes on the map, but it ended up being just a flop, and basically no deck has played it at all, which is really unfortunate. As I said, I'm just looking for Thrawn, guys. I'm looking for Thrawn. Anyways, that's going to be the end of the video. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Let me know what your kind of cards that you evaluated poorly or any other card that you thought was going to be just absolutely amazing or complete garbage and turned out to be way better than it was. I think the one that's the most surprising on the list that we went over today was really the Chaos of War. This is a card, again, that I thought was going to be amazing. And while it is a solid sideboard option and it can be really good in some games, it really did kind of make me sad to play it. Especially when I was playing in like Kylo Red, which is all about just getting in the last points of damage, and you're not going to have a lot of cards in your hands, so you're not even going to be dealing damage to yourself. But Chaos of War just didn't get it. Just didn't get there for me, and unfortunately, that's where he ended up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.